This show me models the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a very important part of proteins, and proteins are basically what make up things like muscle tissue. Animals and plants, it's very important for them to have proteins, but in order to actually take up nitrogen, there's quite a cycle. About 79% of the atmospheric gases are actually composed of nitrogen, but it's nitrogen in the form of N2 gas. Animals cannot absorb this nitrogen, so even though when we take a breath of air in, 79% of that is N2 gas, but all of the N2 that comes into our lungs, all of that N2 is going to exit out. We can't absorb it just by breathing in. So let's see how we actually get nitrogen into our systems. Well, one way, so if we follow this arrow here, there are bacteria that are found on the roots of things like legumes, and this is called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And what it does is it changes the N2 gas into something called a nitrate. Nitrate is not N2 gas, but it's now NO3. It has slightly different properties than nitrogen gas. Now, nitrates in the soil can then be absorbed by plants, so if we follow the arrow, so now plants can actually take up the nitrates, so that's how the plants get nitrogen in them. And then animals, such as ourselves, when we consume the plants, then that's how we finally get nitrogen into our systems. Now, you can also follow another way. Lightning itself actually will convert and change the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and it helps the nitrogen bacteria, so nitrogen-fixing bacteria, to then convert it into things such as ammonia. So then once we have the ammonia, there's another type of bacteria in the soil. It's called nitrifying bacteria, and they do the process of nitrification, and they change the ammonia into something called a nitrite, which is NO2. Then it further nitrifies, so it changes again slightly into nitrates. And then we're kind of right back to where we started. So now that we have these nitrates, now the plants can absorb the nitrates, the animals can consume the plants, and finally that's how we absorb nitrogen in our system. So let's look at the reservoirs of nitrogen. So looking at the abiotic or non-living reservoirs or storage tanks of nitrogen, we would have the atmospheric nitrogen, which would be a very large reservoir of abiotic nitrogen. Then you would also look at the ammonia and other nitrogen-containing compounds in the soil. We would look at the nitrites in the soil and the nitrates in the soil. So those would be your main abiotic reservoirs of nitrogen. The biotic reservoirs are going to be the living temporary storages of nitrogen. So that's going to be basically the plants that uptake the nitrogen, and then the animals that uptake the nitrogen as well. So those are your biotic reservoirs of nitrogen.